Okay, in this Come Follow Me episode, we are going to talk about the family Snitch, the Elias, and the Yoke. Here we go. All right, so first opening up in Matthew chapter 10, we get a transition from all of the healing that Jesus was doing in chapters 8 and 9 in last week's lesson. And this is a transition over to the apostles at this point. In verse 1 of chapter 10 in Matthew, which we will cover first, it says, "And when he had called unto him his 12 disciples, he gave them power against unclean spirits, to cast them out, and to heal all manner of sickness and all manner of disease." So this is a concept of the gospel, which is a fluid hierarchy. We'll get into that in another episode. But basically, Jesus first is established as the healer. He then calls his 12 disciples and gives them the same charge to go out and do what he has just been doing. So the Gospels here, the writers of the Gospels have, in their narrative, created Jesus as the healer first. He brings in his 12 disciples, and then the authors show these 12 disciples where they are now also healers. So it's a duplication. It is a rule of proxy by some degree, because how are they doing these things? They're doing it, the disciples are doing it in the name of Jesus Christ, right? As they exercise the priesthood from their ordinations. So a fluid hierarchy that we see here being initiated, a very core gospel principle that we'll get into later another time, and the idea of proxy, that the priesthood is a power used by proxy through normal dudes. And Jesus gives each of these disciples the charge of going out first to the house of Israel, to the lost sheep of Israel. And later we'd be looking more at the Samaritans and the Gentiles down the road that are associated always with the Melchizedek priesthood. And he says, "As ye go, preach, saying, the kingdom of heaven is at hand." So again, as we've discussed previously in previous episodes, this is one of the major messages of Jesus, is that the kingdom is at hand. The kingdom being the fullness of the gospel and the fullness of the Melchizedek priesthood, moving from just an Aaronic law that is in place all the way up to a complete fullness of the gospel that Jesus is restoring as the head of his dispensation. So his role, not just as the Savior here, is being marked by the authors, but his role as a restorer and as the head of this dispensation of Melchizedek priesthood keys and truths. And he goes on to tell them in verse 9 here, "Provide neither gold nor silver nor brass in your purses, nor scrip for your journey, neither 2 coats, neither shoes, nor yet staves, for the workman is worthy of his meat." I like this principle. To me, what this is saying is something very similar to fasting. Get rid of the idea of materialism, that somehow the material items around you are what sustain you. They're not. It's not your food. It's not clothing. It's not money. What ultimately should be sustaining you in your life is the Spirit and the truth and the gospel and the core principles of the atonement, faith, repentance, etc. Not any kind of a material provision. So fasting gives us that opportunity, right, where we have a chance to stay away from something physical that is a physical provision for us. And apart from just sacrificing, and apart from saying we are willing to go without, what we're really saying here, or what we are also saying here, is physical things are not as important for me as spiritual things. And then down in verse 16, he says, "Behold, I send you forth," talking about to the disciples, "I send you forth as sheep in the midst of wolves." This is a throwback to previous chapters where we talked about sheep or wolves in sheep's clothing. Here he's referring again to sheep and to wolves, but he's saying that the disciples are actually sheep, and they're being thrown out into the world of wolves. The world is full of wolves. And so he's giving this imagery that is contrary to the image of a wolf in sheep's clothing. And he follows up with that in verse 17 by saying, "But beware of men, for they will deliver you up to the councils, and they will scourge you in their synagogues." Why? Why would this happen? So this gives us another idea of the state of things in Judah and what is happening. They are in a position with an intense, high-level ideological possession that is driven by rules, very demanding, specific rules that are added on top of the law of Moses. And it's done all in the name of God, right? And so this power, which we can easily see being centralized in Jerusalem, is easily executed throughout the land of Judah and throughout those that would be followers or that are tied to the temple at Jerusalem. That it can easily be executed, this power is easily executed through these demanding, specific tasks and laws and rules that everybody has to follow. And this is what Jesus is coming in saying. He's saying, you are all slaves to this. As you have been focused on the lower law, it has gotten worse and worse to the point where you are simply products of this lower law and you are slaves to it. And I am bringing you freedom from this. And I am bringing you a higher law and a higher level of thinking, a higher level of living, a higher level of hoping, and a higher level of knowledge that will help you escape out of these things. But those that have the power here are the wolves. And so they're not going to like that message, right? They want to hang on to the power that they have here. And Jesus is becoming a bigger and bigger threat very early on to that power structure that they have, which is based on what they are saying is a religious, God-like way of life. So that's hard to get out of, right? I mean, if that's the belief that this is, I'm doing what's right, all these tasks, everything that I'm doing, I must do because I'm perfecting myself and I'm doing what is obedient. That's a hard thing to change, a very hard thing to change, but that's what Jesus is attempting to do here. And then Jesus gives us a further idea of the dynamics, the power structure, and of the fabric of society in Judah. This is what he says in verse 21. And the brother shall deliver up the brother to death, and the father the child. This is the family snitch. And the father the child, and the children shall rise up against their parents and cause them to be put to death. How does this happen? What kind of a society does this happen in? The only place that this happens at this level of what he's saying is in an ideologically possessed society. And that can happen in our day. We saw this especially in the 20th century throughout Europe and Asia, where you have on the right, you had Nazi Germany and to lesser degrees in Italy and in Spain, where you had right-wing authoritarian regimes. And how do they gain power and make sure that their ideology is followed? Well, it's kind of like what you basically do is you show how bad and evil anyone outside of your ideology is. And you make it worth, even to a family member, even to a child or a father or anyone else, you threaten them with horrendous consequences. And you teach them and indoctrinate them that anybody that falls outside of this ideology is worthy of death or extreme punishment. And once you've gotten that into society, once you have inserted this into an ideological position in the hearts and minds of men and women, and children especially, then you have a society of fear, because you don't know who's going to say something to you and who's going to snitch on you. And that's what's happening here in Jerusalem and Judah, is that, hey, if you're following something that Jesus is saying, if you're following him, maybe even those that may have even followed him at first would have been tortured or would have been shamed out of their villages, or would have been killed, would have been stoned to death, or who knows what else. And that might have been a real big issue for Jesus's crowds being able to grow larger and larger and larger. Certainly this is what they did to Christ. And so to think that it didn't happen to many others before that, I think would be a little naive. And so he's saying that what will happen, and he's forewarning them. Of course, he's going to push forward with his message anyway, but he's forewarning them that children and parents and brothers and sisters and others will turn on their own in a society of fear. That's easy to do. And in a society of ideological possession, that is easy to do. You have the Nazis where, if you started saying something that was against Hitler or against the regime, then you had a great fear of being turned on. And that could happen by anyone. Because what would they do with the Hitler Youth and others? They would take the children. They would go to the children who have not had life experience yet, and they would teach them that their parents were evil. And then they would have them turn on them if they saw them do anything, and they became spies to their parents. The same thing happened on the left. So if you go to Lenin, and a lot of people will say that didn't happen with Lenin, it did happen very fiercely with Lenin. It especially happened with Stalin later on. It happened with Mao in China. It happened with Pol Pot. It happened with Castro, right? Where if you were not on board with things, then you're in trouble. And even your closest relatives might turn on you and snitch on you. So that's what Judah is about at this time. And then Jesus gives the principle down here in verse 32 that we've talked a little bit about before. It's kind of like this platinum rule. We have the golden rule, and we discussed previously what we might call the platinum rule, which is something that is not to our fellow man, but something that where we have a relationship with God and correspondence with God, rewards through God. He says here, whosoever therefore shall confess me before men, right? So in this environment, regardless, if you stand up for me, him will I confess also before my Father which is in heaven. So again, it's up to us first to have the courage to stand up for our values, to stand up for the values that Jesus Christ is going over here, and to hold them not just in our minds, that this is what we believe in, etc., but to actually live it in front of other people, regardless of what they might say. And if we do that, then he, in return, reciprocation, will go up the chain for us. So we go up to Christ, confessing his name, standing by him. And then he goes up the chain, and he talks to the Father. And he is then our advocate for the Father. And that is another part of this fluid hierarchy that we'll talk about. And he follows that up in verse 34, saying, think not that I am come to send peace on earth. Now, he's the Prince of Peace. So what is he saying? He's the Prince of Peace. Well, in order to get there, in order to get to a position of peace, you're going to have to go through some problems. And he says, I came not to send peace, right? That's where he wants us all to get. But because of the environment that he is coming into here, his job is not to be peaceful, right? That's not what he's doing. His words are going to be a massive disruption to Judah and to those in power. So he says, I came not to send peace, but a sword. So I think of the imagery of the sword, right? There's a couple of things that we can look at. One would be the cherubim with a flaming sword. What does that sword represent? What do the cherubim represent? They represent justice. So he's coming down with justice being laid on the current society and the way that they are living and what is being taught and how the people are being enslaved and frauded out of their existence through a theological and ideological sovereign over them, tyrant over them, and bringing the truth into an environment where fraud and deception and force are the rule of the day is like a sword coming in, right? It's going to cut those that are living by those things. And then down toward the bottom of the chapter here, Jesus says to his disciples, again, something that has to go with that fluid hierarchy and that platinum rule. He says in verse 40, he that receiveth you, being the disciples, receiveth me. And he that receiveth me, receiveth him that sent me, or the Father. So we get again this hierarchy, this operation of proxy that comes originally from the Father down to the Son, and then down to the disciples, the apostles, and then down to others, eventually to others, the 70 and others, and then eventually down to everybody else. And so this is kind of the structure of the church, where there is this fluid hierarchy and this priesthood of proxy that is given to us all the way from the Father. And Jesus gives us this principle as he calls here in this chapter. He calls the apostles and sends them out to preach the gospel. All right, then we move over to chapter 11. And here in chapter 11, as the apostles have been called, Jesus then transitions, sends them out, and he then goes out and preaches on his own as well, going throughout the cities, mostly in Galilee. And John the Baptist hears about this. Now, John is now in prison. And so he sends two of his disciples out to find out more about what Jesus is doing. And Jesus tells the disciples, hey, down here in verse 5, chapter 11, the blind receive their sight, and the lame walk, the lepers are cleansed, and the deaf hear, and the dead are raised up, and the poor have the gospel preached to them. So he is the Messiah. That's what he is saying. Yes, I am the Messiah. These are the things that I am doing. I am bringing the kingdom of God here through these acts, and I am the healer, and I am he who the prophets have prophesied of, because this is what they had prophesied of. So that's what he's saying to these disciples to carry back as a message to John the Baptist. And then Jesus speaks of the disciples of all of those that were followers of John the Baptist, saying, who is it that you've gone to see? And he says that there is no greater prophet than John the Baptist. And yet, and here's another insert by the authors here about the higher and the lower law that we oftentimes discuss. And yet, he says in verse 11, verily I say unto you, among them that are born of women, there hath not risen a greater than John the Baptist. Notwithstanding, this is a point and a lesson that he is giving, notwithstanding, he that is least in the kingdom of heaven is greater than he. What does that mean? Well, again, look at the kingdom of heaven as a Melchizedek reference. And he's not saying that John is not worthy of the kingdom of heaven, certainly. What he's doing here, if this was maybe translated just a little bit differently, but what he is pointing out here in this principle is that John represents the Aaronic law. And regardless, if somebody else is put out as a Melchizedek priest or given the ordinances of the Melchizedek priesthood in the temple, they are greater than John and what John represents, because John only represents the Aaronic priesthood. And so it's a lesson that Jesus is putting forth about the higher and the lower law. He's incredible. John is the greatest of prophets, but he is not as great as the least of those with the Melchizedek priesthood. Very important point that he makes here as he is bringing the Melchizedek priesthood out from the darkness and into the light. And then in verse 12, a very important principle as well here. And from the days of John the Baptist, he says, until now, so matter of years, the kingdom of heaven suffereth violence. So again, this is a reference to what is probably happening to some of the disciples. When I say disciples, I don't mean just the 12, I mean everybody. Some of the followers of John the Baptist and some of the followers of Jesus, that they are probably being persecuted quite a bit. And he says, now the kingdom of heaven suffereth violence, and the violent take it by force. Isn't this an interesting principle? That whenever truth comes through somewhere, it seems that there is manipulation, certainly there is influence to try and push it off by those that don't want it. But ultimately, given time, it seems that the truth is going to win out. And so what do those who don't want the truth do? They resort to force. And we can see that in all examples. I gave the examples of some of the regimes in the 20th century. They gained their power by force and by violence. Ultimately, that's how you have to do it. Think of just how, and by the way, this happened in some of Christian history as well. This certainly happened. And it happened coming into the Americas. It happened in a lot of these instances. But, and there's probably, you could say, some ideological possession going on there, even within Christianity. But think about how the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints operates. The church operates in a way that almost exclusively converts are gained one by one. You'll have every once in a while an example of some village in South America that converts. But for the most part, souls are converted through love. They are converted through teaching. They're converted through the Spirit. And it's almost exclusively a one-on-one basis. That to me is something very special and something that rings very true to me as to how the truth would work. It might take a lot longer than otherwise you would want for your goals. But it works on an individual basis. And we in that sense, we are giving an enormous amount of respect to free agency and an enormous amount of respect to individuals and their choice and having them actually convert internally because they want to. And it doesn't always happen that way, of course. Nothing is perfect. But that is, for the most part, how the church operates in trying to get the message of the gospel out through the missionaries and through member missionaries, etc. And then after praising John the Baptist, but making sure he distinguishes between the higher and the lower laws and the higher and the lower priesthoods, he follows that up with this comment about the Elias. In verse 14, then he says, "And if ye will receive it, this is Elias, which was for to come." Now, in the Joseph Smith translation, if we go back to this, it reads like this: "And if ye will receive it, verily he was the Elias." Making it more specific. He was the Elias who was for to come and prepare all things. Now, if you've listened to my previous episodes, especially going back to the first episode that I did about John the Baptist in the Come Follow Me series, you'll know about the preparing of the way that John's role fulfilled and how important that is. Here, Jesus calls him the Elias, which is interesting. There is a doctrine that Joseph Smith had discussed for a number of years before his death, but that he had not finalized. He had been thinking about this. He had been praying about it. He had been receiving revelation on this. but he had not really delved in to make this concrete by the time of his death. But we hear about the spirit of Elias, right, which is the preparer. So John the Baptist is the preparer. There is always something that comes beforehand to prepare the way. For who? Actually, it's for the spirit of Elijah. We think of the spirit of Elijah in the terms of the temple, but that is only a small portion of what that means. We've kind of used that as kind of a catchphrase to rally us around doing temple work, and good for us. That's great. But the spirit of Elijah has more to do with the Melchizedek priesthood as a whole, of course, which is centered and sourced by the temple. So the spirit of Elijah is the one that actually will come. In other words, Jesus here is the Elijah, and John is the Elias. Now, interestingly enough, Elias is just the Greek version of Elijah. So it's the same word, it's the same person. So there's a lot there to work with that is a little bit confusing. But there's no question that Joseph Smith had separated this Greek version of the name, being Elias, the preparer, the forerunner, and then Elijah, who would be Christ and a representative of the Melchizedek priesthood. So as we've discussed the higher and the lower law, here Joseph Smith is solidifying that even more. And unfortunately, he didn't get to pen this all down and make it concrete. But he's in the midst of doing this at his death, where he has Elias as the lower law, the forerunner, and Elijah as the higher law, the Melchizedek law that he had in place. And these two, the spirit of Elias, the spirit of Elijah, and how those two things worked and how they worked together and relied upon each other. So the spirit of Elias and the spirit of Elijah are really representations of the higher and the lower law. And then Matthew finishes off here in the end of chapter 11 with the following two verses and a metaphor. He says in verse 29, "Take my yoke upon you." And you think of yoke, what that is it is the harness basically that you would put over, for example, an ox, and really over the oxen. So let's say that there are oxen one next to each other, two of them, and you would put the yoke over both of them. It's one piece typically that you would put over both of them. And I always had the hardest time understanding this principle because he says this. He says, "Take my yoke upon you and learn of me, for I am meek and lowly in heart." Isn't it interesting that he's saying this? I am meek and lowly in heart. As we said previously, this might be that he's obedient or he's a covenant keeper and lowly in heart, in contrast to all of these words about force and violence and snitching on other people. He's saying, no, that's not how this works. This is how it should work. Let me give you an example of a yoke and how that works, right? That's what he's doing. He's saying, "Take my yoke upon you and learn of me. I am meek and lowly in heart, and ye shall find rest unto your souls." Now, I used to think, well, how is that? Your yoke is pretty difficult, I would think, right? I mean, you end up getting crucified, literally crucified and suffering and spit upon and everything you can imagine, shamed beyond belief. So how is it that taking the yoke of Christ upon us is something where we would find rest unto our souls? And I always had a hard time with that because he says here in verse 30, confirming what I just said, he says, "For my yoke is easy. My yoke is easy and my burden is light." And the more I've thought about this, my take on this is now that what I believe is that, again, those oxen are side by side. And if there's one ox, and that is Christ, and that harness that goes over two people, if you're under that with him, so that you're relying on his strength, pushing forward to plow, for example, then his yoke is light because he's carried all the weight. And therefore, if we can rely on him, then that makes things easier for us and gives us rest to our souls and makes our burden lighter, because we have put and do put and can put our burden on his back and on his side of the yoke. I'll talk to you next time.